It is his firm belief, I'm sure, that colleges and universities have a duty not only to prepare you to excel academically, but also to leave the colleges and universities with a strong moral and ethical values. What did the German teachers teach? What did their preachers preach? How in short 12 years of Nazi rule, one of the most advanced countries in Europe, the crown jewel of Europe, descended into barbarism. We must understand that the architects and designers of the gas chambers and crematoria were highly educated people. They were barbarians with PhDs. All that is necessary for evil to prevail is for good people to do nothing. Sin is not just an act of commission. It is also an act of omission. Most Germans were not Nazis, but that did not matter. That did not prevent the slaughter of innocents and most unimaginable cruelty. Historians, scholars, theologians will study for many years to come that black hole in history called the Holocaust. By the way, I prefer to use the Hebrew word Shoah. The word Holocaust comes from the Greek meaning a burnt offering, the kind that were brought to the temple in Jerusalem in the days of old. The Bible refers to them as reach nichoach l'Adonai, a pleasing odor unto the Lord. The smokestack of Auschwitz were not a pleasing odor to man or God. The Hebrew word Shoah means catastrophe, destruction, horror. It much better describes the terrible time. I was born in a little shtetl, in a little town in eastern Poland, formerly eastern Poland. Today, there's the Ukraine. Jews lived in Poland for 1,000 years. They were invited by King Boleslav to develop commerce and industry, and this they did indeed. The 16th century was called the golden days, the golden age of Polish Jewry. It was referred to as Paradisus Judaeorum, a Jewish paradise. That paradise turned into a burning inferno in our time. Most of you, I'm sure, have studied about Auschwitz and Treblinka, but few people are aware that long before Auschwitz was ever built, 1.5 million men, women, and children were murdered by bullets, by mass shooting, as Father Patrick Dubois describes in his book, The Holocaust by Bullets. Every time I enter a synagogue or see the memorial to the 6 million, something inside me wants to cry, there are names and faces behind the number, people I knew and loved. So today I will tell you what happened to one family in one little town in eastern Poland, not because there was something extraordinary about their lives or their deaths. On the contrary, what happened to them happened in hundreds and thousands of towns and villages, large and small, in those days. In 1939, I was 11 years old, totally unaware of the gathering storm. That summer, my mother, grandmother, and cousins went on vacation to the Carpathian Mountains. Life seemed beautiful and full of promise as I splashed in the cold mountain brook. In the middle of August, a telegraph arrived from our father asking us to return home immediately, that war was imminent. My mother woke us up, and as we walked to the railroad station, she found a little cabin and a little grocery store with a few provisions. He didn't have very much there, so she bought a lot of candy and cookies that were around. And I thought to myself, well, if the war starts like this, it can't be terribly bad. So I sat in the train and munched on my sweets and didn't understand why the grown-ups were so worried. At every station we passed, though, we saw Polish trains moving west towards the German border. What we did not know, at the same time, German army trains were moving east, and on the train were graffiti. We are off to Poland to thrash the Jews. Thousands of miles from my little town of Horodenka, plans were set in order to destroy and to demolish everything we loved and cherished. When we came home, we learned that Germany had issued an ultimatum to Poland. The country was mobilizing. My father was too old, my brother too young, but both served in civil defense. September 1st, 1939, the date forever embedded in my memory, war broke out. Our city was bombed. There were a number of civilian casualties as we ran for the shelter every time we heard the sirens. News from the front was getting worse day by day. We heard that Warsaw and many other cities were bombed. On the third day, we found somewhat encouraged. We heard that England and France declared war on Germany. We were sure that war will not last very long. We saw the Polish government fleeing into exile to Romania. We were very close to the Romanian border. There was discussion at home that perhaps my father and my brother should leave. We heard that men were taken to forced labor. But surely everyone thought women and children would be safe. Not in our wildest nightmares could we have imagined what was to come. There were no prophets of old to warn us of the impending catastrophe. My parents were steeped in German culture. They spoke the language well. They loved literature and music. They could not imagine such barbarity from quote-unquote civilized nation. As Stalin and Hitler pact took effect, Poland was once again divided, and eastern part of Poland was occupied by the Soviets, by the Soviet Union. September 17, Poland fell. When the Russian occupation started, after a few weeks, schools were open. We had to learn a new alphabet, a great deal of Soviet propaganda. We were told that we live in the best of a possible world under the leadership of great Stalin. Yet the reality on the ground was quite different. We would hear the trucks at the night as community leaders, political leaders, both Jews and Gentiles, were exiled to Siberia. Little did we know, though, that exile to that frozen wasteland of Siberia was much preferable to what awaited us all. On June 22nd, 1941, Germany attacked the Soviet Union, and we were once again, there were battles in our city and a number of casualties. July 41, Germans occupied our town, and the reign of terror began. They put up 7 they burned the synagogue, they burned the scrolls, and beat the rabbi mercifully. They proclaimed that if we don't follow all their orders, that they hung 8 Jews selected randomly and told us if we don't follow all their orders, that's what's going to happen to everyone. Here are some of the proclamations. All Jewish men from the age 14 to 60 must register for forced labor. All Jews must wear a white armband with the blue Star of David. And here the Nazis miscalculated somewhat. This was surely a passport to death, but it was never a badge of shame for us. And today it graces the state of Israel, the few free Jewish state in 2,000 years. Jewish children cannot go to school. As I stood at a corner of my house and saw some children walking to school, I ran to my mother and said, why can't I go? I was a pretty good student and a well-behaved kid. And never forget the pain in her eyes she could not explain. Not only could her children not go to school, but she as a teacher could not do what she liked best, to teach. Jews cannot enter stores. Jews cannot socialize with Christians. Jewish and doctors and lawyers cannot practice. All radios, gold, silver, fur, precious items had to be turned to the German authority. I had a little coat with a fur collar and was very angry when I had to rip it off because the Germans needed for their fight in the frozen Russian area. Needless to say, anything the Germans like in your house was simply theirs for the taking. This was the greatest robbery and thievery perpetrated by a standing government in broad daylight. My grandmother was an Orthodox lady, and she refused to part with her Sabbath candlesticks. And so in the dark of night, as all the children and grandchildren stood around, they were buried in the garden in the hopes that one of us will be able to survive and to retrieve him. By the way, this summer, one of my good friends from New York went to my hometown of Vorodenka and asked the Ukrainian owner of the house if they ever found the candlesticks, if they ever found any letters or any pictures. He denied of ever seeing any. I have absolutely nothing from home. The unrelenting terror night and day is difficult to describe. Those of you who might have seen the picture Shoah or Schindler's List can visualize some of the deportations, but the constant random terror is hard to imagine. When you had the misfortune to run into the German on your city streets, you had to take off your hat and bow. If you came alive from this encounter, it was pure chance. People were beaten, dogs were trained to attack them. Sabbaths and the holidays were the worst of time. This was when most of the actions, most of the roundups took place. My father continued to work at the flour mill as an accountant, and he told us that his superior, a German called Mr. Miller, was a pretty decent man. Yet one night he came to our house with his orderly strapped gun, and as I was sleeping in the next room, suddenly I saw this man in uniform standing around over me and mumbling something in German, my golden angel, my golden angel. I didn't understand a word. My father came in and had me dressed quickly and whisked me off to my grandmother's house. Next day, we heard the terror that my parents experienced. He put a gun to my mother's head, and he insisted that she confess that by dieser an Arier gewesen. In other words, that I was fathered by a non-Jewish person simply because I had blonde hair at the time. In October 1941, ghetto was established in our town. A few streets were sealed off in mostly Jewish section of town, and we moved to my grandmother's house, which was in that part of the city. As the horse-drawn wagon came to pick up a few of our possessions, I picked up my little kitten to take her along. And my mother said, put her down. I said, why? There won't be enough food in the ghetto. And I said, what? Not enough food for a tiny little cat? Well, it didn't take long to realize how right she was. The ghetto was hermetically closed, and starvation raged in the ghetto. Initially, my mother tried to normalize our life as much as she could. So she organized classes for me as my friends, which was strictly forbidden under the German law to teach Jewish children. So we sat in the dark room and studied history and math and poetry. Years later, I wondered, why didn't she teach us how to make Molotov cocktails? Not that she knew, I'm sure. Yet one by one, my little friends disappeared. Really a silly euphemism. They were murdered. As winter approached, hunger was felt in the ghetto. The rations were extremely small, and you saw children with swollen stomach begging on the city streets. A soup kitchen was established, and an orphanage was organized in our town. My grandmother also opened a soup kitchen because my father still worked in the mill, and we accessed for some flour. Yet the lines were getting longer, and the soup was getting thinner. Rumors were flying. The Sonderkommandos, the death squads, which operated in our region, were coming in our way. Christopher Columbus, Browning, in his book Ordinary Men, described the group of these mass killers, the Reserve Battalion 101 of the German Order Police. These people were recruited from every walk of life. They were policemen, teachers, postal workers, truck drivers from the city of Hamburg. They were too old to serve in the military, but they were young enough and strong enough to kill innocent men, women, and children. Within days of coming to our area, Daniel Goldhorner wrote, they were Hitler's willing executioners. Commander Doppler came to the Jewish Community Center, and he told us that if we give them 5 kilograms of gold and other precious objects, that he will make sure that our city will be spared. But our city was not spared. On Friday, December 4, 1941, the order was issued that all Jews must assemble to be inoculated against typhus. Some of the people wondered, why did the Nazis suddenly wonder about our health? Yet a well-known doctor in our town told us that he was given hypodermic needle and called to get some nurses together, that was what really was going to happen. Some people, like my father, were skeptical, and so he hid us in the attic of the mill where he worked, the flour mill. As more and more Jews assembled in front of the great synagogue, they're suddenly surrounded by the Gestapo and the Ukrainian auxiliary police and herded into the synagogue. They were kept there for 2 days and 2 nights without food and water, and then driven away in trucks. On our turn home from the hiding place, we assembled in my grandmother's house and found out that my mother's youngest sister, our beautiful redhead Aunt Mincha, was taken away. Her husband and 3 children were crying. My grandmother tried to reassure everyone. She said, we'll find out where these people were taken. We will send my aunt warm clothing and food, and maybe we can even buy her freedom. We went to sleep somewhat reassured, only to wake up in the morning and find out about the tragedy that befell our people. 2,500 men, women, and children were driven to a forest, to a nearby village of Siemakovce, 12 kilometers away. They were forced to disrobe in a barn, and a group of 5 approached the ravine where there were machine guns. The music was playing to muffle the sound of the guns, and our people were murdered in cold blood. The Gestapo chief Doppler came to the Jewish community, and he demanded 2,500 marks for the bullets spent killing the Jews. Public mourning was forbidden. Any men, Jewish men unshaven, as our custom of 7 days of mourning, will be killed. They collected the clothes from the victims and had Jewish women clean them. The best they sent to Germany. The rest were sold on the city streets. After the Aktion, Commander Doppler said that from now on, if the people work hard and provide him with whatever it is that he demands, no more killings will occur. Deception and lies were the order of the day. The noose was being put tighter. We felt trapped and abandoned, and the world was silent. What we did not know, that in January 2042, the top Nazi officials sat around the table in Wannsee, the suburb of Berlin, and planned the final solution, the annihilation of all the Jews. These were not some creatures from a distant planet. These were barbarians with PhDs. Some of the young people fled across the border to Romania. Many fled in the woods and joined partisans. Sadly, not many survived, surrounded by the death squad and the Nazis. Everyone tried to build a shelter in their home, a bunker as we call it, and so did my father. It was a room disguised by a bookshelf, not unlike the one I saw in Amsterdam not many years ago, where the family of Anne Frank was hidden. I remember being carried by my father half asleep to that bunker before sun rose. We stayed there for a while, and if the Gestapo didn't arrive in town, we came down. Another day in the ghetto began. On Passover, April 12th, the second Aktion, the second roundup took place. Again, the chilling scream, Judenraus, Jews out, were heard everywhere. For 2 days and 2 nights, the Aktion continued. Those that were caught were brought to the railroad station and loaded into cattle cars. Once again, our father hid us in the mill where he worked, in the attic of that mill. By the way, 1997, I visited that place and climbed to the attic of that mill, and the sound of those thieves in the attic forever remained in my mind. We sat there trembling and hearing the shots all around us. I remember awakening there at dawn and hearing most plaintive whistle of a locomotive. I did not know that on the train going to Auschwitz was my dearest childhood friend, Genya Rice. Genya and I used to save every penny to go to see another Shirley Temple movie. Do we still know who Shirley Temple was? We wore Shirley Temple rings. We played with Shirley Temple cutout dolls. And she always insisted someday she will be a singer in America, no less. I could never top that one. Genya was 12 years old. We assembled at grandmother's house, and she was on the train bound for Belzec. We assembled in grandmother's house and counted our losses. On the train bound for Belzec, and by the way, Belzec was not like Auschwitz, to the right or the left, to the crematoria or to work. In Belzec, within 24 hours, all the people were murdered by gassing. We assembled and counted our losses. On the train to Belzec was my uncle Nathan, his son Max, 13, and cousin Visha, 19. I will never forget the battered face of my cousin when he returned to the ghetto. He jumped out of the cattle train. He told us horrible conditions in that car, the heat, the starvation. Many people jumped out. Sadly, he did not survive. The third Akция, the third roundup, took place September 1942. The old and the sick were shot and buried in a Jewish cemetery. The young and the strong were taken to railroad station, locked into cattle cars on their way to Belzec. Our town was declared Judenfrei, free of Jews. And so it is today, as we saw a number of years ago. All the surviving Jews had to leave the town within 24 hours. The exodus of the pitiful remnant to the neighboring ghettos began. A cycle of consolidation and destruction continued. Our family met at my grandmother's house for the last time. They decided the most merciful thing to do was to give my grandmother a lethal injection and bury her with honor and spare her and try to spare her the horror of yet another ghetto. So my uncle, who was a chemist, entered her bedroom where she was resting, as all of us were sitting in the living room, tears running down our faces. We loved our babcia very much. After a few minutes, the door opened. He came out sobbing and apologizing to us. He just could not do it. Even then, he could not become a mercy killer. He gave each of us, even children, most precious gift at a time, a capsule of poison. We had to promise that we will only use it in the worst of extremities. And so my frail and ailing grandmother, the pillar of strength for us through all this time, was put on a horse-drawn wagon with other old and sick people. The rest were driven at gunpoint to run to the next ghetto of Kolomea. The Ukrainian police and German on horses beat them with their whips as they ran. Only a handful of Jews remained in town, so-called wertvolle Juden, Jews that they needed, that they were valuable to them. My father was amongst them. But he couldn't keep my mother and my brother and me with him. So we wound up in the next ghetto of Kolomea. My mother wound up in Kolomea, we were in Tluce. That winter, my mother made a last attempt to save my life. She met a Russian man who said that he would be willing to take me away on false papers, take me away to a faraway village where he took my cousin. And my mother was overjoyed. At least one of her children would have a chance to survive. So she spent the next 2 days teaching me catechism, teaching me how to behave in church. As a teacher in Polish public schools, she knew all about it. She was present when the priest instructed the children. And every time my resolve waned, she kept repeating over and over again, someone must survive to tell the world. And so it is the title of my memoir, Someone Must Survive to Tell the World, in English, and was published in France as well. The evening came when I was supposed to meet this man at the station. I said goodbye to my brother and my cousins and walked with my mother to the edge of the ghetto. I was to take off my arbed, the Jewish star, and try to steal my way across the gate. As we embraced, it was clear to me that I will never see her again or see my brother again. I was sure that all our people were murdered. And why would I want to live a life of a lie? And I told her, I'm not going. My mother did not try to urge me. She realized how uncertain and full of danger that attempt was. She allowed me, at the age of 14, to make my own decision. And so we walked back to the ghetto, and I had a few more precious weeks with her. My mother contracted typhus at the age of 39. She died of starvation and disease. We were left 4 children, 2 of my cousins and my brother. That fall, another accident occurred in the city of Tlusta. And my cousin Bella, 17, and her sister Visha were murdered in the town. Visha was a deaf mute. She never heard the shot that ended her short life. I also became very sick with typhus and don't remember very much of that winter. My father credited my survival what he called the miracle of the eggs. Apparently there was a Polish man who found out, do your children left all alone? He once worked with my father in the export business, and he brought some eggs. We had very little else, potato peels. But more than that, he brought a light of human kindness into that world of darkness and despair. I was delirious for a long time. No doctor ever saw me. There was no medicine, no food, no clean water. When I gained consciousness, I was very weak. It took two people to help me to walk. September 43, my brother and I were taken to a labor camp of Lisovce. I pretended to be 18. We worked in the fields. The work was difficult. But in an open field, we could always find something edible. As well the fact that the commander of the camp was a pretty decent man. And they allowed rations that one could survive. July 1943, we worked around the clock at the threshing machine. My group rested at a haystack. Before dawn, we heard shots all around us. The SS, one shot, one gun was shot, and a little girl whose mother was hiding among the working people was shot in the foot. She was bleeding profusely and whimpering. We were told to go to the assembly place and wait there for the further orders. The graves the men were ordered to build the graves, and the shooting continues. Suddenly, our commander, Mr. Frank, as I mentioned, who was one of the few people at the time who was a decent man, he came riding on a horse and screaming at the Gestapo that he needed us for work, that they can come after the harvest and kill us all. The shouting continued. After a while, the Gestapo left, and we proceeded to collect our fallen comrades. And among them was my brother Julek, 17. The days that followed were in a haze. I wandered aimlessly, did not go to work. I did not want to continue. Yet one day, as I was walking in the compound with my head down, I saw a pair of black boots of our commander. I was sure that the end I had longed for had come. Yet he asked me how old I was and told me to go to his house, to his villa, and tell the cook to give me food and clean clothes. At the time, I didn't realize that there was one man who still had some decency at that time. And so that summer, I worked in the attic of his house, knitting sweaters that he sent to his family. And there I met a girl my age, Fritschka. She was also left all alone. And just being with her brought me back to life a little more. We promised that we survive this hell, that we always try to be together. The news of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising lifted our spirit. During the winter of 1943, we worked outdoors without gloves, stockings, and wooden shoes. In the bitter Polish winter, and temperature dipped below zero very often. Fritschka and I slept in the same bunk. We shared every scrap of food we could get. One night I felt that she was burning up. I did not need a medical diagnosis to know that she had typhus. I went outside and got some snow to cool her forehead and went to work. Around noontime, shots were heard in our compound, and I knew that Fritschka was no more. A friend told me that he was asked to help her put her shoes on, and she said, "Where I'm going, I don't need any shoes." With her head held high, she walked outside the barracks, where she was shot. Only a dirty brown stain remained in the snow, washed it away. Fritschka was 15 years old. The Gestapo swept through our compound, and anybody who was sick, unable to work, was shot. The news of the German defeat at Stalingrad renewed our will to go on, to see that evil empire destroyed. On March 44, quite unexpectedly, Russian troops liberated our camp. Yet before we could take one breath of free air, 8 Germans took a plane, flew over our camp, and threw incendiary bombs. The barracks were wooden and burned fiercely. Those who tried to escape were machine gunned from the air. The Nazis did not want any witnesses to the horror they perpetrated against civilian populations. Among the wounded was one woman we called the Nightingale. She had a beautiful voice. I tried to reassure and tell her we'll take her to the Russian field hospital and we will try to get help for her. But all she said, "Hold my hand a little longer. For me it is too late." And indeed, her beautiful voice was stilled forever. V-Day, Victory Day, did not bring much rejoicing. Surely, we were glad that the carnage had stopped. Yet it was only then we began to realize the extent of our losses. I am the only survivor of 14 members of my immediate family and many, many more distant relatives. We began to comprehend how great the tragedy befell our people. A third of world Jewry was murdered. European Jewish culture lay in ruins. Great institutions of learning, scholars, writers, artists were no more. The survivors had to live with one of the most painful accusations made by ignorant people. They walked like sheep to slaughter. No one ever accused the 500,000 Russian prisoners of war who were killed by the Germans, or the 20,000 Polish officers who were killed by the Soviets in the Katyn forest of cowardice. Yet somehow they expected resistance from civilian population. And resist, they did. The first civilian uprising in any Nazi-occupied territories was in the Warsaw Ghetto. The starved, isolated, and poorly armed members of the Jewish Defense Organization fought valiantly, knowing full well that victory or survival were impossible. They fought to die with honor. They held out longer than the whole country of Poland, with a standing army, air force, and world support, fell in 17 days. They held out longer then the Maginot Line in France. There was resistance in death camps. 2 crematoria were blown out in Auschwitz. There was resistance in Sobibor and Treblinka. Our partisans fought in the forest and field. The most famous Jewish poet of the 20th century, Avraham Sutzkever, joined the Jewish resistance fighters in the forest outside of Vilna, which he described in his unforgettable poem, Valdix, or in Forest. News reached us repeatedly in labor camp of battle fought, greatly outnumbered and outgunned. Few survived to tell the tale, and many lie in unmarked graves in forest and fields. Jews joined resistance fighters in every occupied country in Europe, France, Belgium, Italy, Yugoslavia. They fought in the Jewish Brigade of the British Army. For the survivors lay a long and difficult road ahead to find our place in the world and to learn to live a normal life again. The famous Russian poetess Anna Akhmatova wrote at the side of the mass grave in Babi Yar, "I would like to call you all by name, but they have lost the list. I did not lose the list. It is inscribed on my heart with a searing iron. L'chol ish yesh shem. Every human being has a name," a popular Hebrew song proclaims. But the Nazis robbed our people of their names and branded numbers on their arms. We ask, where were the world leaders? Where were the scholars, the theologians, the spiritual leaders? Why was their silence so deafening? The Shoah could have been prevented, but for the world indifference. We must understand that hatred, bigotry, anti-Semitism will lead to the gates of Auschwitz. As Abraham Foxon, chairman of the Anti-Defamation League, reminded us recently, the gas chambers and the crematoria of Auschwitz did not begin with bricks. They began with words. As our days are dwindling, we leave our memories in your hands. Preserve them and pass them on to yet another generation. Thank you.
Testing. Okay. Thank you, Tosia, for once again retelling the story and fulfilling your mission for your mother, that someone must tell the story. And I want to thank you all for coming here this afternoon. We're going to open it up for some questions that you may have for Tosia at this time.
When did you come to the United States?
I came in 1941 under SS Marine Flesher, and as I approached the harbor of New York and saw the Statue of Liberty, it really was a very important and moving day for me.
So what were those first few days like when you came here to
New York? Well, first, when I got off the ship, I didn't have any papers, and I was terrified. What will happen if a policeman on the corner will ask me for my papers? Well, I was reassured that it doesn't happen in America. And then a cousin of my mother's invited me to stay with them in Peekskill, New York. And I recall the first day, we still at the time spoke Polish to each other. And the first day the radio was blasting, and I prided myself that I knew some English in German high school where I studied for a while. We studied Shakespeare and Chaucer, and I saw I understood it. And suddenly, as I was getting more and more upset, and I asked my cousin, what's going on? I'm the first day in America, and all I hear is Jews and Jews, and what do they want from the Jews? And she started laughing and crying. It was advertising for orange juice. But it took a while to learn normal life. It took a while to understand that America is different, thank heaven.
I have a microphone if some of you. Stephanie.
I just want to ask, some of your Jewish traditions and your religious practices, were you able to connect with some more people that kind of reminded you or taught you about your traditions? Once
You mean
got
after or before?
After.
Yes, of course. I was for a while in Germany, and there were camps there. There were many refugee camps. I met with people. I was, at that time, 15. I knew about the traditions. I grew up with them, so that was no problem at all. The question was of finding belief again, of trying to understand why this horror occurred and why so many people stood by and didn't do anything about it.
What advice do you have for this generation to prevent from these kind of situations happening again? What is your advice for all of us?
First of all, to be aware how precious our democracy is, and not try to demonize our people, other people, being for religious or racial reasons. We are all one humanity. And just don't let it happen in this country.
Tosia, thanks very much. You were targeted because of your faith, or at least your family's heritage. I wonder what role spirituality or religion has played in terms of your life from then on.
Mm-hmm. Well, there was a period, of course I was very young, there was a period where I could not enter a synagogue, I could not pray. The question was, how could God permit something like this to happen? There is a Kabbalistic, let me read something for you. It is the phase after the Shoah. There is a Kabbalistic concept called Tzimtzum, the mysticism. And Tzimtzum means withdrawal or contraction and concealment. And they believe that God withdrew from actively participating in human history in order to allow men to express free will. Mankind received a roadmap at Sinai, the Ten Commandments, instructions for ethical and moral life. I still question why a merciful God did not hear the prayers of millions of innocent. Yet questioning God is an old tradition, a Jewish tradition dating to the patriarchs. So yes, I follow my customs and my religion, yet I do question why this happened to our people.
Any other questions or comments? Tosia, maybe you could just share where you went when you were first liberated, going to Romania. Maybe a little bit about that experience, where you first felt safe.
Well, we were liberated by the Soviet Union, by the Russians in 1944 in March. Some of the local population, unfortunately, followed the Nazi theories and theology. We were not safe in those places. We had to leave. And we were starving. And somebody told me across the border in Romania there was food. So we made our way at night and crossed the border. There were no borders. There was still war going on. And as we stood there in our wooden shoes and drags, the way we were clothed, we were surrounded by some Jewish people who had relatives on the Polish side of the border. And one gentleman came over and said he was a cousin of my mother's. and took me home to his wife. She took one look at me and decided to burn all my clothes. And I remember standing for the first time and having a shower. We could not bathe, we didn't have any clothes to wear, and looking in the mirror and stunned. I was not a child anymore. I haven't seen my image for years, and it was strangest feeling. I didn't know when I grew up. And it was difficult to learn normal life again. I remember the day the war ended in 45. The Russians were at the time in the town. Music was blaring for everywhere. They were dancing in the street. They were rejoicing. Surely I was glad that it ended, but it suddenly I realized more than ever what had happened, that I was all alone. My home was no more.
Okay, I'll give you one last opportunity. Yes, Tobin.
Maybe this is too much to ask, but what do you do with, what have you done with the anger and yeah.
There's no such thing as doing with anger. The one thing I know that I never traveled in Germany, my husband and I. It was a Prophet George attack, by the way. We traveled in Europe a great deal, but we always danced around it. I just couldn't face Germany. Not all of them were killers, but I never knew if I met the man on the street if he wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. Then life took over. I have 3 children, 5 grandchildren. I taught Hebrew at the temple in Atlanta, and then wrote my memoir.
Yes.
Throughout your travels when you were overseas, not in America, and you said you have to travel at night, was it often, did you feel like you were not going in the right direction?
Are we talking during the war or after?
During
the war. We weren't going everywhere. We were just either in the ghetto or in the labor camp. There was just one attempt I made and then said, my father, during the First World War, had what they called an adjutant, a Ukrainian man. And he used to come to visit us, and he put me on his lap and told me how much he liked my father and so forth. And after my whole family was killed, I just needed someone to tell them, look what happened to us. So I sneaked out of the labor camp, pretended that I was Ukrainian, and actually passed through a gauntlet of police, and they didn't recognize I spoke the language pretty well, and came to the house of this man. And he opened the door, and he saw a ghost. He said, what are you doing here? They just killed 3 people in this village yesterday. And it was one of the hardest things to take. I saw that he will take me around, and we will cry together for what happened to the family. I realized immediately that there was totally different attitude. So I told him, all right, I will not endanger your life by staying here, but could you give me a pair of shoes? My feet were bleeding. I was walking barefoot as the peasants did then. He told me, no, he didn't have any. Could you give me some pair of something to bind me? He didn't have any. So I said, could I just stay in your attic overnight, and I will leave in the morning? And he said, okay. When I was leaving, he called on some other person to come to see me who knew my father, and he said that guy would want to help you, to save you. He came and talked to me, and something in me didn't feel right. I saw he might go to the Gestapo next day, and for a pound of sugar, which they got, he would denounce me. So this friend of my father gave me half a loaf of bread, and I left. And it was the final blow that somebody, I didn't want anything from him, I just wanted his sympathy, knowing what had happened to our family. And that was it. And this man had all, whatever precious, we're not rich people, but whatever precious possessions we had, my father trusted him. My uncle was a doctor, and all his instruments were hidden in his garden. And this is the man who acted as he did. It was a blow. It was a real blow.
Did you ever find out anything of what happened to your dad?
The most, no, exactly not. But when they rounded up people that last time, the strong ones and young ones were sent to Lublanka, and those who were older were killed in Sheparovsk and outside of Kolmea. So most probably that's what happened, because my father at that time was over 40 already. That was considered old. But I don't know exactly. Yes?
Yeah.
After you establish yourself in America, were you able to find a certain degree of happiness?
You need to speak louder or come closer. I can't hear.
After you established yourself in America, were you able to find a certain degree of happiness?
Yes, of course, but it was always mixed. Was that little, when my first child was born, it was such a joy. Yet there was nobody to say, he looks just like your father, or, you know, it was very difficult to try to bring up a family without anybody, without family around us. I remember meeting once a group of second generation young people, and somebody asked them, when did you know? You know, did your parents sit you down and said, well, you know what happened to me? They said, we never did not know. It was just, you felt it, there was no question. When we had a holiday, I would invite a lot of people around the table, so maybe they will not notice. There were no grandparents or uncle around. But eventually, of course, when they grew up, they knew the story. Yes.
Have you met other survivors, and if so, how was that experience?
Yes, there is a group here. There is the Bremen Museum. Maybe some of you will go to Atlanta and see there is a special exhibit there about the Holocaust. And a lot of school kids. Last year, there were 20,000 school children who went through the museum. And we meet there regularly. So there are a number of survivors, but obviously I was a young child at the time. Our numbers are dwindling. There are not too many in Atlanta anymore.
Any more?
Okay, well, thank you.
It's one thing to read about the Holocaust, and it's in the textbooks and it's been well documented, but it's quite different to actually hear a witness talk about it firsthand. And now you folks are all witnesses, okay? This is different now. From this day forward, you're going to be a witness to a survivor and hear the actual story and have met her.
May I add that Elie Wiesel said that to hear a survivor is to hear survivors to become a witness.
Okay, so you are now the witnesses, and many of you are going into the teaching field, and you will speak differently to your students about this, and that's powerful, okay? There's nothing like a real story. So Tosia, thank you again so very much.
Okay.
She has some books. We have just a limited number of them. If you want, they're $15, and she will autograph them for you. I mean, she'll sign them with your name. And if you want some pictures, I brought a camera, and we can do that. And so thank you very much this afternoon, all of you, for coming and being here.